that rolling. That notion that the problem with humanity is that we've all been drinking too much and we're not paying attention. Which I don't know about you, but when I drink too much, I'm clearly not paying attention. So what is it like for humanity to kind of come out of that sense of being disoriented and find orientation in life again is really what the Gospel of Thomas is all about. And throughout this series, you're going to hear how, in a very unique way, the Gospel of Thomas kind of connects us to the opportunity to awaken. It doesn't necessarily define what that looks like or what the character of that is, but you'll definitely hear throughout this gospel the way in which maybe Jesus used language to try to wake people up. And that's what we'll hear as we move through this space. So before we get there, some challenges that the Gospel of Thomas has, I think, for us as the Christian community. And when I first started thinking about what to do for a summer series, I wasn't going to do the Gospel of Thomas at all. So this was a little bit of a change of plans. My original plan was to go back to all of the Soul Forum podcast interviews that I've had and to try to tease out of those interviews conversations with people out in the public. So these are not people who are always a part of congregational life, although many of the interviews were with people within this congregation, but a lot of them were just general people who are seeking a spiritual journey, but have framed it much differently than you and I might frame it. And to try to listen to them closely enough to hear what is the character of their own soul's journey, and what are they learning along the way? And trusting, and I think this throws us back to what the Gospel of Thomas is all about, and trusting that everybody, every probably living thing, but certainly every human, has within them this capacity to take a journey into their most authentic self, or their sense of their deepest sense of who they are. Their soul's journey is open to all, and we're all required to take that journey. And for those of us who would rather not take the journey, who would rather just drink our lives away, according to the first reading in this text, it doesn't become available to us. It doesn't provide us any good. When will you put down the cocktail and start paying attention to the way soul might show up for you? So one of the things that the Gospel of Thomas did for the Christian community that I think it's important to start with, and I'm not sure, I know you sat where you normally sit, so whether you're going to be able to see anything I put on this whiteboard, I have no idea, but I'm going to try anyway. As you know, the way in which we've constructed, oh Lord have mercy. Is there, Bruce, I worried about this. I said I should have a backup pen, a backup plan and a backup pen. This is a square. You know how many Gospels we have, right? There's 4 stories about the life and teachings of Jesus. Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and John. What's important to know is that when the Bible was kind of closed, right, the canon was created, those 4 narratives provided, for the most part, the way in which Christianity has described who Jesus was and what is the point of church anyway. You know, what is this Christian life all about? They came from those 4 Gospels. What you might remember from previous conversations is that those Gospels were each written at different points in history, right? So they didn't all collaborate, follow Jesus around and take notes and then put these Gospels together, but they emerged at different points in the evolution of early Christianity. Do you remember what's the earliest Gospel? Does anybody remember what the earliest Gospel is? Yeah? Mark. If I had a pen, I'd write Mark up here, but I am now writing Mark in font that you can't read. So Mark is the earliest of the Gospels. What's interesting is that you'll find that when Mark wrote his Gospel, here comes something. What do you think?
Got whole writing.
Oh my goodness. All I want is black. Give me black. Thanks, Bruce. When Mark wrote his Gospel, if you read Luke and Matthew, you will find all of Mark's Gospel, for the most part, inside of Luke and Matthew. Did you know that? So both those Gospels used Mark's content, and they expanded on it, or they changed it, or they modified it to match the kind of the situation that was going on in their context. But they all started with Mark. Mark was like the springboard. So you'll find Mark, in a sense, buried inside of Matthew. You'll find Mark buried inside of Luke. And they borrow a lot of Mark's stories. Some they leave out. Some they add themselves. Scholars have said that there's another source besides Mark that Matthew and Luke use that we've never found. They call that the Q gospel, which means just source in German. So they had Mark, and they maybe had something called Q, and then the other two Gospels were written. And then finally, much later, John was written, the last of the Gospels. And some authors think that John's Gospel was kind of the last Gospel to go in there that was actually a counter-narrative to the content you're going to learn about in the Gospel of Thomas. Because before there was Mark, there was the Gospel of Thomas. So before Mark even wrote a narrative, this way in which Thomas constructs his narrative was around. And we didn't know that until 1945. 1945, a guy by the name of Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, but just Muhammad Ali, was looking for some, what was he looking for? Looking for fertilizer, digging up fertilizer, and he ran into this big stone jar. And inside this jar is all these old manuscripts. And as they started to unpack these manuscripts, they found that they were a compilation of all sorts of different stories of Jesus' life. But the one that had the most pop and spit to it was the Gospel of Thomas, because they realized that inside of Mark were a lot of these stories that were inside the Gospel of Thomas. And Gospel of Thomas doesn't have any travel narrative at all. It's just a collection of the wisdom sayings that might have been as close as we can get to maybe what Jesus was up to. So this is an important book, right? It's an important book because even though we close the canon to these four Gospels that tell us a story, we know now that there were other stories and other narratives that probably predated any of this material. And Christianity really struggled to say, well, then how do we go forward, right? Do we add another gospel inside of the four that we know already? And if we do, will it change the way in which we think about what Christianity is all about? In fact, there's one of the books that I picked up when I was at the Westar Institute. They don't call it the four gospels, they call it the five gospels, because it's that important. Right? So they add the Gospel of Thomas inside this narrative. But what's more important to me, and that I think that helps, and we'll see how, Bruce, is this erasable?
They said driver.
Okay. Before I make the sin of putting a non-erasable marker on the, well, let's see how this works, right? So we know, oh, that's not bad. We know there's something that predates this content material. You still can't read it? It's funny because Lori said, Dan, the whiteboard is so passé, just leave it be. And I said, no, they'll see it. And she was right. So I'm going to pretend like there's stuff on here and just use my body language as the communicating tool. So there's pre-material that informs this material, right? And so the one thing we have to come to grips with, I think, as a Christian community, and this is one that you need to just think about in general, is that we assumed that this gave us a snapshot of who Jesus was. But that the early movement that you're going to discover, the Jesus we meet in the Gospel of Thomas does not look a whole lot like the Jesus we meet here. In fact, the Jesus we meet here looks a little different than the Jesus we meet here. And the priorities of the Jesus that we meet in the Gospels are different than the priorities we meet here. So what happened? Why did they start, what would you say, almost like expanding upon the character of the Jesus we meet in the pre-material when they started to write these Gospels? And is there enough content there that might make us rethink who Jesus might be for us today, or how even Christianity works? And we're going to get a little bit of that today when I finally get there at the end of this talk. What I think is intriguing is that, and if I could draw something, I would draw another arrow out to that space. This is where the whole soul form journey happens as well. Because if we can accept that there is and will always be a fluidity in the way in which we relate to and give expression to our own faith story that was already early on in action, and now we know it even more robustly because of the Gospel of Thomas. If there is a fluidity, then this trajectory that created this one could also create one for today as well. So that in some ways, Christianity is not about getting it right, but being part of a particular kind of journey that is always relevant to the times in which you live. And that gives us freedom, right? It gives us freedom to pay attention to our world and to live this story in our world in new and creative ways, just like they did when they inherited this little world and tried to apply it to their context in their time. And in many ways, what happens is the walls of the canon that keep this kind of set apart wash away. And we realize that it's always been a movement. And then being Christian today is participating in that movement through time and place. And that's an okay thing, right? So by the time John writes, he would prefer in the Gospel of John that the Gospel of Thomas didn't exist at all. He would rather say, no, let's just lock down who this Jesus is. And you can see that in John's Gospel. I'll show you some examples of that. But in reality, this is the character of how Christianity works. It's much more fluid than you might anticipate. So let's talk a little bit about the Jesus we meet in the Gospel of Thomas. As we, let me see if I want to do, yeah. Let me start by referencing some work by Elaine Pagels. So I've got a number of books that are forming the study. You can grab these books if you want. One of them is called Beyond Belief, The Secret Gospel of Thomas. That's one that's going to inform this. And the other one is a great scholar who I dearly love by Stephen Patterson called The Gospel of Thomas and Jesus. And those in combination with a few other sources are kind of guiding what we're doing here today. Elaine Pagels puts it this way in her book, which I think is an interesting way to think about the Gospel of Thomas. There we go. She writes, the Gospel of Thomas, it ends up teaching us that God's light shines not only in Jesus, but potentially at least, it resides in everyone. Thomas's gospel encourages the hearer to seek to know God through one's own divinely given capacity, since we're all created in the image of God. For Christians in later generations, the Gospel of John helped provide a foundation for a unified church, which Thomas, with its emphasis on each person's search for God, could never do. So you can hear in Elaine Pagels' little assessment already what might be partly the problem of the Gospel of Thomas. And it's partly a Pentecost problem, right? For the Gospel of Thomas is going to say that every one of you is created in this divine image, right? So that your journey into spirituality has to, in a sense, birth its way out of your particular life situation, who you are, who you really are, right? And that's the journey that Jesus took. You need to take the same journey. But it's not about believing in Jesus. It's about going on the journey. It's not about a destination. It's about going through the process of finding your own inner light. And that became a little bit problematic, as we'll see as we spend some time this morning, for those who ended up in this camp here. So what might that look like? The Jesus that we meet in the Gospel of Thomas, throughout this gospel you're going to find, is somebody who helps humanity wake up through the use of what they call aphorisms, very short little catchphrases that make you realize that maybe you've been asleep the whole time and you need to snap out of it. And what the Gospel of Thomas doesn't do is it doesn't provide a religious path at all. It doesn't point you to an institution. It doesn't point you to dogma or teachings. It just says you have to go on that journey. Because that journey is a part of who you are. I mean, God is inside of you, so find that light and let it shine. That's definitely Gospel of Thomas. And it's an empowerment gospel, if you will, to say everybody can take that journey. Everybody needs to go down that path. And we as a collective need to hear how that path is going for each of us. In many ways, it's an invitation for all of us to take seriously this idea that spark of God resides within all of us. Can Christianity accommodate such a thing? Here's what Elaine Pagels writes as well. In light of the Nag Hammadi discoveries, which is where they found the Gospel of Thomas, so that's where they found it, and the research that helped clarify what I cannot love, and that is the tendency to identify Christianity with a single and authorized set of beliefs. Rather, now that scholars have begun to place the source discovered at Nag Hammadi like newly discovered pieces of a complex puzzle, next to what we have long known from tradition, we find that these remarkable texts, only now become widely known, are transforming what we know as Christianity. So for Elaine Pagels, she sees that adding the Gospel of Thomas to what we already know can change the way you think about your own Christianity and your own Christian journey. Well, what might that look like? So let me talk a little bit about what that might look like, and then we'll kind of wrap up for today a little bit. One of the things that we notice about the Gospel of Thomas is that the Jesus we meet in that gospel is what they call a vagabond radical. A vagabond radical. And you can hear this in other gospels as well, one I'm going to read to you in a minute. But Jesus did not have a place. He was always moving. In fact, he was, in many ways, rejecting the idea of the place that had been established, whether it be by Rome or even by the religion of his day. He saw the vibrancy of God's movement inside common everyday life. And so that's where he moved, and that's where he engaged. He was a traveler. He had no place to lay his head, right? He just was always on the move. And he wasn't dependent on a big system to support him. He was dependent on relationships, right? If Jesus showed up at your house one day, if you had something for him to eat, awesome, that'd be great. But if not, he'd go to another house, and he was just super dependent on the community life. That's sort of the way he was. You see that over and over again, sometimes in some of our stories in the four Gospels, but you definitely see that inside of the Gospel of Thomas. That Jesus was someone who required, and this is the tricky part for us today, that the journey begins by untethering yourself to the systems that keep you intoxicated. Maybe lazy, maybe not doing the real work, maybe not really seeing who your neighbor actually is, right? All of that systemic kind of force in world, you have to untether yourself from that. And the only way to untether yourself from it is to leave it all behind and to be a wanderer yourself. Now that sounds great when you're young, but I don't know about you, but I've got a lot that keeps me from doing that kind of lifestyle in my current existence, and you probably do too, right? We can't imagine that we can disconnect from all the systems that support our common life because we're dependent on them, right? But that's the challenge of the Gospel of Thomas. It says the way to enlightenment is this disconnect from those systems and to begin the journey into a total trust of one another and what God is doing in your life. That's where the journey begins. You can hear some of the tension of that in even Mark's Gospel. You'll remember this story, but I bet you can hear a little bit of this Jesus that emerges in the Gospel of Thomas from this story. Notice how it even starts, right? This is from Mark chapter 10, verses 17. So this is Jesus. As Jesus was setting out on his journey, you notice he's moving. As he's heading out on his journey, which is supposed to be what you're supposed to be doing too, a man ran up to him and knelt before him and asked him, "Hey, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, well, no one's that good. You know the commandments. Do not kill. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not defraud. Honor your father and your mother. And the man said to Jesus, "Well, teacher, I have done all these things from my youth." And then Jesus looked upon him lovingly and said to him, "Oh, you lack one thing." You remember what this is? "Go and sell all that you have and give it to the poor, and then you will receive the treasure that is in heaven, and then you will be able to come and follow me." And at that saying, the man's countenance fell, and he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. Remember that story? You can hear the tension between the Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas model of Christianity and what was to become Christianity already brewing in Mark's Gospel. And what was that tension? The tension was that the early movement of Jesus was a very fluid and detached, like a collection of wisdom sayings that would awaken you up. You would disconnect from the culture and you would live radically different than the culture, so to find your own soul along the way. That's the way it was. But by the time these folks started writing the Gospels, these communities were finding ways to integrate Christianity into more settled communities, where there was infrastructure, where there was leadership models, where there was a logical way in which we shared resources. And so the radical character of this sort of wandering wisdom of Jesus couldn't work inside of everyday life. And so the Gospels that we have are what we would think of as sort of domesticated Gospels, right? How does this story of Jesus work when I've got a house and kids and a job and, responsibilities? The domesticated Christianity that we've grown used to and we think was normative was actually a response to the inability to keep this pattern going. That we just couldn't perpetuate a religious institution inside of a normative social fabric, given what the Gospel of Thomas was telling us Jesus was doing. If that was the case, I'd say, why are you sitting here listening to me? Right? Why are you supporting this big institution? What's the point of all that? Just go on your way. Go on your journey. You don't need any of this stuff. Right? There's no sense of authority. I don't have an authoritative voice, neither do you, but you have to take the path that God is calling you on. Right? That would be the goal here. So it's very tricky to perpetuate an institution with this particular model. Let me finish with a little bit. Let's see if I can find this next quote that I wanted to give you. Oh, here we go. So this is now Patterson describing this problem. While the gradually domesticating communities of the synoptic Christians, right, that's this group. That's because he's a scholar, he can't just say it like it is. You've got to write it like he does. While the gradual domesticating communities of the synoptic Christians, the wandering radical ethos began to give way to a more conventional code of conduct. In Thomas Christianity, the wandering radicalism of the Jesus movement continued to define its way of living in the world, but it's not the way that could be absorbed inside of the emerging Christian communities of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and ultimately John. So what you see is a little slice of wisdom that got left behind until we found it in 1945. And for me, the question of this little series is, maybe what can we glean from this source of wisdom in the Gospel of Thomas that we can still apply to the early church and to our time as well? Is there some wisdom that really predates the Gospels and gets closest that we can to the life and teachings of Jesus? Is there something there? In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is seen not as a savior, and so all of that, there's no talk of the cross in the Gospel of Thomas. There's no talk of the resurrection in the Gospel of Thomas. There's no talk of Jesus as being the Son of Man or the Son of God in the Gospel of Thomas. There's no birth story in the Gospel of Thomas, because it has nothing to do with any of that. That's salvation theology. Like Jesus died for your sins. That's all salvation-based theology. For the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus wasn't anything like that. Jesus, rather, was a revealer. Someone who pulled the veil back so that you might find a new way in which you could live. It's Christianity as a lifting of the veil, of finally getting off the sauce, right? And no longer being numbed out, but seeing life for what it really is and engaging it in this vibrant way. That is part of the Jesus movement that we learn in the Gospel of Thomas. And ultimately, what's interesting is that the name Thomas actually means the twin. And that's the goal of anybody who follows the Jesus of Thomas. And that is that you become the twin of Jesus. You don't worship Jesus. You don't hail Jesus as the only one, but you become the very replication of who he was. You pick up the mantle of the Spirit that God has invested into you, and you become that twin. And you can hear it, in a sense, in some of the more radical sayings inside the Gospel of Thomas. So let me finish with this one, which is a fascinating one that comes out of this book. This is a saying 108 out of the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus says, "Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. I myself shall become that person, and the hidden things will be revealed in him or her." Let me read it again. Jesus said, "Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. I myself shall become that person, and the hidden things will be revealed to them." The Gospel of Thomas would say, if you want to follow the Christian path, then be the twin. Be the twin. All right. That's what I'm going to leave it for today. Next week when we get together, we're going to talk a little bit about when and where you can take this journey. And you're going to get introduced next week to a notion of, what's a good way to put this? There's a concept in the biblical narrative in this block that is waiting for the second coming. And inside of that is a terminology we call, they use realized eschatology, we call it. And I'll explain it a little bit next week. What does realized eschatology means? How does the end manifest itself when it hasn't arrived yet? That's what realized eschatology is. That is a big part of this story. Gospel of Thomas has a different way of thinking about it. As if, where is this kingdom we're looking for? And how do we get there? And when does it come? He's got a completely different notion of it. And it's a beautiful notion to add to the one that we've already come to understand through these Gospels. Okay? So let me pause there and see if you've got any questions for me. Bruce does have a microphone, and I'll give you maybe 2 questions for today, since it's kind of new material. If you've got a question that you want to raise up, if I can't answer it today, I can also address it some other time. But anybody have a thought or a question they want to share about GOT, this early stage? No? Are you following a little bit? Do you maybe ask you this question? Are you sensing the difference at this point between the two enough to where it's somewhat intriguing? I hope so. The other thing that you'll hear when you hear these Gospel of Thomas texts read, they sound a little bit like Jesus, but with like an edge to it, right? Like you just heard, right? In fact, this communion that you're going to have is one way of, in a sense, ingesting this Jesus so that you might transform into twin, right? So even this meal tradition would mirror some of these Gospel of Thomas quotes that Jesus had. Quotes that are probably as close as we can get to the actual words of how Jesus spoke, right? These are the collection of sayings that are probably pretty close to what he was saying. All right, no more? Yeah, yes. Marcia, there we go. Welcome to church, Marcia. Good to have you. Here's a microphone so we can hear you.
In terms of absorbing this gospel that was found in 1945,
Correct.
Correct? How do churches throughout the world, as well as, like Friday, we were at St. Dominic's for our granddaughter's graduation from the intermediate school. But again, biblically, they even have different books in their Bible that are different than our Bible.
Correct, yeah.
So the question is, how does Rome deal with the lost gospel that was found? Presbyterians, other religions of the USA as well as the world.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I will tell you that the challenge has been, because since this thing showed up on the radar screen in 1945, it fell into the hands of academics, right? Because they had to figure out what the heck it was. And that's where it's resided mostly. So in the circles of academia, that will eventually percolate and find their way into like seminary life or maybe even into congregational life that might include something like the Gospel of Thomas in its cycle of readings. That will take many years. The established church has been somewhat resistant in trying to embrace it aggressively, but it has been embraced aggressively through academia, right? So that's who's really working on it. And they're the ones who are the early canary in the coal mine to say, hey, wait a minute, the Jesus we're meeting in here is a lot different than the Jesus we met in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and John. But what do we do about that? And it's going to be up to the church over time to decide whether it wants to do anything. What I think it is doing is not necessarily intentional, but I have noticed that churches are much more accommodating to the way in which you might be constructing your own spiritual path, right? We're not requiring as much conformity to a singular way of thinking about it. And that's partly because the society is helping us to be more inclusive and open and diverse anyway. But this will help in that conversation, I think. So I think it's coming, but it just hasn't come to church life yet in many churches. And I will say, when I used to go to all these conferences that worked on this stuff, I was just blown away by the work that scholars have done on this. And I'm like, why am I not hearing about this? Why do I have to go listen to this person to do? Because it's just not mainstreamed yet. And it's still not. That's a really good question. One more, Nancy?
Okay, so I really find this interesting. All right, so in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus describes himself as God as his Father.
Correct.
And God comes down at his baptism in the form of a dove.
Correct.
And so one would infer that Jesus' wisdom comes from God because he's, like so connected.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus, you started off by saying it's a lot of wisdom, short, snippets of wisdom that helps one to wake up. Does Jesus describe in the Thomas Gospel, how did he come to this wisdom? What is the source of his wisdom if it's never stated that God is his Father? Was there some other leader that he was following, or Was it just more, society is so screwed up, we've got to find a new way?
Yeah, it's what a super question, Nancy. So I would say yes to all the above. The one thing you need to know about the Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas is he's not a divine being. That all of that kind of divinity of Jesus stuff emerges here. So Jesus is just a regular Joe, and it's mostly about speaking out against societal damages that have been done in his time. So the question is, where does Jesus derive wisdom from? By the time this gets put into place, it's definitely coming from God. Jesus is the Son of God, right? So we have that connection. But this Jesus frames it a little bit differently. That it says, it's already inside of you. It doesn't have to come from anyone. It's already in you. So it's something about a journey that is a birthing out from who I am, rather than a waiting for a revelation from the outside to inform who I might be. But you're going to hear that a little bit more as we go into the Gospel of Thomas. That this light that you're wanting to shine out, it's already inside of you. But you buried it through accommodating yourself to too many cultural norms. And we probably get a little sense of that from time to time. But it's a really great question about how do you, where's the source? And then, to your point, once the source is God, then it becomes an authoritative voice. This has less authoritative capacity because it's like, well, if it's inside you, you got to go find it. I can't find it for you. I can't even tell you where to find it. It's yours to find. Or have you been drunk the whole time and didn't notice that? That's what happened in the first reading. So it's a really different kind of distinction, I think. All right, we'll come back next week or watch these online, and then we'll keep this conversation going. And I hope to provide a little bit more Q&A in future sessions as well. I'm trying to shorten up my content a little bit, but at least to give you a primer of what's going on today. And then just a reminder that after you commune today, to invite you to pick up a candle and maybe just think about how is that kind of Gospel of Thomas spirituality, that God's light is really already within me. How do I connect to that inner light? And play around with that as we spend 8 weeks together listening to the Jesus inside the Gospel of Thomas. Okay, with that, I will then invite you to rise as you're able, and let's sing together some music as we reflect on this theme for today. The hymn of the day is hymn number 400. Hymn number 400.